When my sister Shelby vanished, when they officially declared her dead, I refused to believe it. Deep down, I knew she was still alive. I could feel it, and I was right, sort of. And so, here I am, sitting in my car at 2:10 a.m. near a darkened bus stop that probably hasn't seen another visitor in decades, waiting for her, despite being warned of the consequences. I'm writing to distract myself from the nearly overwhelming, increasingly strong prey instinct to run, the urge to put as much distance as possible between myself and what I can only describe as the receding nothingness beyond the tree line. 28 days ago, Shelby was driving through Meyerton, a tiny town I'd never heard of until I got the call from the police, until it became the last place my sister was seen before seemingly falling off the face of the earth. I'm still not sure why Shelby was there in the first place. It was far out of the way from Billings where she'd been headed, but I suppose that'll be one more thing I'll never get the answer to. Not from her, at least. They declared her dead. When the Meyerton police called me, they told me they found her car, that bright red 15 Mini Cooper she loved so much, wrapped around a tree on the side of the road. If she'd been in the car when they found it, maybe I'd have been more inclined to agree with them. The car was mostly totaled, but what did remain of the interior was immaculate. There was no blood. Her purse and suitcase were there, keys still in the ignition. It was still locked from the inside. Everything was still in the car. Everything, except for my sister. But the local authorities told me she was dead, and despite my pleas for them to look for her, they straight up refused. No need, they said. So I knew it was on me to find her. I was running late on my first visit to Meyerton. A delayed flight and mix-up with my rental car when I finally landed meant I wasn't approaching the town until it was nearly 12 a.m. To top off an already bad situation, I was lost. My GPS told me to take exit 19C, but I couldn't find it. I'd taken several U-turns and looped back a few times, and each time grew more and more frustrated as I'd see 19A, 19B, and then exit 20. It's not like 19C was recently closed either. The guardrails were perfect, seamless, and beyond the highway was nothing but trees and craggy rock. No, it was more like there wasn't an exit 19C. There never had been. And to further exacerbate my building anxiety, my GPS refused to provide me with an alternate route. As far as Google Maps was concerned, the only way into Meyerton was to take an exit that didn't exist. After 3 more loops around the highway, I finally gave up and stopped at a crappy motel, conveniently located off exit 19B. I asked the guy at the desk if he could suggest a way to get to town, since at that point I had no clue how I was supposed to find Meyerton. He looked tired, and not merely 1 a.m. tired. No, he looked exhausted by life, tired, and didn't even bother glancing up from the book he was reading when he dismissively told me, "It'll be back in the morning." "The exit?" I asked, sarcasm a thin veneer, as I tried masking my racked nerves and that I was on the verge of tears. "Or the town?" He shrugged non-committally. I lost it in that moment. Head and hands, I broke down sobbing on the dingy check-in desk of that seedy motel. He was kind enough to ask if I was okay, and I instantly found myself telling him everything. Why I was headed there, how unhelpful the authorities were, how I knew the only way I'd find her is if I went searching for her myself. After a brief silence, he quietly confided that he'd also lost someone. His fiancée had gone to Meyerton several years ago, and she too had disappeared. Did they ever find her? I asked it automatically, even though I was fairly sure I already knew the answer based on the decades worth of misery etched into his face. So it took me by surprise when he nodded. He stared off into space for the longest time before he whispered, "I wish they hadn't." He introduced himself as Gary and told me that my sister Shelby was gone, that nothing good could possibly come from me going to look for her. When he couldn't talk me into turning around and going back home, he offered me a room for the night. As he handed me the key, he reluctantly told me that 19C would be back at 2 a.m., but would be gone by 11 p.m. the next night. I knew he was messing with me, that no road would magically appear. I figured I'd try to get some sleep and then drive to the next town over to see if someone else would help me. So, you can imagine my utter shock the next morning when, sure enough, just like Gary had assured me, where before there had been a solid metal guardrail, there was an exit. I'd found 19C. The worn gravel and peeling paint of the off-ramp seemed to indicate a well-traveled road too. So I followed the winding one-lane road through the trees, and I was confused yet relieved when I found my way to Meyerton. That relief was short-lived. The police were somehow even more unhelpful in person, insisting Shelby was gone and I should go home, move on. It didn't matter that she'd only been missing a couple of days. It didn't matter that there wasn't a body. I wasted hours at the station, changing nothing, convincing no one. The case was closed, they told me. As far as they were concerned, my sister is dead. Now, based on what I've learned, I almost wish she was. That would have been more merciful, a kindness even. As I continued my own search for her, the longer I lingered, the more I realized that something was very, very wrong with the town of Meyerton. Every single house that wasn't already demolished sat abandoned, the structure slowly being reclaimed by overgrown lawns and encroaching woods. The sidewalks were empty of people, and I only saw 2 other cars on the road in all the hours I was there. The few businesses that remained open had only a handful of customers inside, and they were clearly not happy to see me there. Every single person I asked told me the same thing. It was eerie how their responses were so similar, almost word for word, as if rehearsed. That they'd never seen my sister before. That there was nothing for me in their town, and I needed to leave. And then, with what seemed like a genuine sadness, they were sorry for my loss. Eventually, 10:50 p.m. rolled around and I'd still found nothing. The stores all closed at 10 p.m. Even those traditionally open for 24 hours elsewhere were closed 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. I'd watched the town shut down, watched it empty of people. So frustrated, I pulled into one of the many empty parking lots and I stared at the shadowy expanse of trees where her car had been found. The air was stale and heavy with an unnerving silence, thick enough to choke on. It was in that moment, as I sat in the red glow of the shut-down pumps of the only open for 19 hours gas station I'd ever seen in my life, that I first picked up the hint of wrongness in the air. I could suddenly feel that there was nothing out there beyond my line of sight, something waiting just past the trees, something terrible. I realized that Gary and the handful of people I'd encountered were right. I needed to leave. I had that epiphany a little too late, because what began to happen next was the cherry on top of my shit Sunday of a day. As I took a final look into the trees, as if they could give me a sign, an answer, a darkness unlike anything else I'd ever witnessed began to seep through them, swallowing them. It choked out the light from the moon. It was like a curtain of nothingness, a presence only detectable by the absence of everything it touched. It carried with it a smell of burning meat mingled with rotting fruit that suddenly flooded through my open windows. I found myself frozen as it approached. As it swallowed the houses down the street, I could feel a strong sense of emptiness, one that sucked the air out of my lungs, threatening to crush me. At the same time, it felt right, an extended invitation towards the embrace of nothingness, towards something ancient and insatiable. The encroaching darkness swallowed the crimson glow from the gas station pumps. It was only the realization that the blackness had begun to nullify the light of my headlights that snapped me out of it. I 3-point turned my way the hell out of there, peeling out and pushing 65 down the winding road out of town. In that moment, I was thankful the town was empty of police too, approaching the on-ramp at 10:59. I didn't understand what was happening at first, why the road I was driving along looked faded. That's when I saw something metal shimmering faintly in the distance. It didn't look solid, as if it wasn't entirely there, so it took me a moment to realize what it was. A guardrail. I tried to swerve and slam on the brakes before I hit it, but I was going almost 90 by that point, and the laws of physics and I had differing opinions on what the correct stopping distance would be. I braced for an ending that I wondered if my body would even feel, brain even register, but none came. No, instead of the sound of metal on metal, my ears were met with the angry honking of the person I'd cut off as I messily swerved onto I-15. I was back on the highway, the light of Gary's seedy little motel visible from across the way. I took one last glance at the place where exit 19C had once been and once again ceased to be. I didn't know what else to do, so I went back to the motel breathless, describing every moment of my ordeal to Gary. He didn't even look remotely fazed by my story, instead opting to stare into space. I realized then that the police were right. She really was gone. She'll be back. Well, part of her will, he finally told me, perhaps in response to the look of hopelessness that must have been written on my face. 2:30 a.m., 28 days after she first disappeared, at the bus stop off Main Street. Are you sure? That's where they always come back. He smiled sadly before engrossing himself back in his book. That was weeks ago. As of this morning, it's been 28 days since Shelby first disappeared. I touched down in Billings and made the 6-hour drive to the outskirts of Meyerton, waiting patiently for the exit to appear. I debated stopping by to see Gary, but decided against it. He'd asked me not to tell him if I chose to go back. He said he didn't want whatever happened to me on his conscience. But it's 2:29 a.m. now, and here I am anyway, sitting at the ancient bus stop in the empty city of Meyerton, a city that has only recently returned to existence, staring into the last of the receding darkness. I can see Shelby in the distance now, pale in the faint moonlight, barefoot, immaculate for someone missing for a month, and emerging from the woods. I found her. Even from here, I can feel something radiating from her, an emptiness, a yearning hollowness, a hunger for something far more precious than mere flesh and bone. I should be running to embrace her. I should be ecstatic. Instead, I'm frozen, overtaken by another emotion entirely, one I've never felt before around my sister. Fear. No, not just fear, an overwhelming, suffocating terror. It's not just that now familiar emptiness that radiates from her the same way it did from the beckoning nothingness when it nearly claimed me last month. It's not even the way her skin seems too tight on her frame, or that she's taller than I remember. No, it's that awful predatory smile on my sister's face, one I have not seen in all of our 26 years together. She moves as gracefully as she did in life, but in her eyes, I only see death. I realize, as I watch the palpable nothingness incarnate that is wrapped in my sister's flesh, that I'm not sure what exactly she wants, what it is that she hungers for. In a way, I wish she hadn't come back. I should have believed those that told me she was gone, because she is. She is utterly devoid of everything that had made her my sister. As I fight the urge to run to the car, to leave Meyerton before whatever it is that wears my sister's skin like a too tight suit can reach me, I can't help but replay my final conversation with Gary in my head. So, I'd confirmed, she'll be back in exactly 28 days from when she went missing? He'd nodded, no longer able to meet my eyes. But I need to warn you, Sheila, if you thought it was bad when she disappeared. He paused to stare past me and into the dark expanse of trees off the highway. It'll be 1,000 times worse when she comes back. I told him I knew I was doing the right thing, that trying to save my sister could never be a mistake. Oh God, she's closer now. I cannot tell if she seeks to fill that void by dragging me back with her, or if the hunger is more primal, more literal. All I know is that the Shelby that disappeared, that I lost, is not the same Shelby that I see before me now. I'm frozen to the spot now, as if I'm trapped by her gaze. I'm going to share this while I still can. Maybe I made a mistake after all. It all started with the window. Now I can't escape. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, but the more I think about it, the less sure I am. One day, I was in my parents' room just hanging out when I noticed the window and curtains were wide open. The sunlight was so bright it practically hurt my eyes. And then it hit me. I was on the second floor, or first floor, if you're one of those who call the ground floor the first. And anyone walking by could see me. I wouldn't even notice. A chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly felt exposed, like someone was looking in. I shut the window quickly, latched the mosquito screen, and left the room. It was summer, so my parents were working most of the time, leaving me home alone. I figured a walk to the park could help clear my head. I sat on a swing, kicking my legs while reading the book I'd brought, The Gift of Fear, one I saw recommended on Reddit. It's all about spotting danger before it even happens by trusting your instincts, e.g., the tickling sensation on your belly like when you are riding a swing. Likewise, I knew about those feelings, especially lately. What better time to start reading it? The park was busy with lots of suspects, people walking by, and the buzz of conversations filled the air. Suddenly, I heard a woman rushing over and saying, "Daisy, be careful." I turned around, expecting to see my mom, but nope, it was another mom talking to another girl with the same name. Weird, right? As the sun started setting, casting long shadows, I figured it was time to head home. But when I stood up, I spotted something that made my heart drop. A woman, maybe in her 30s, sitting way at the far end of the park on a bench. Her hair was white, like unnaturally white, and her skin was just as pale, and she was perfectly still. I tried to brush it off. Not everything is a gut feeling, and honestly, this was probably nothing, just someone resting like me. But as I walked past her, I couldn't help but look again, and there she was, still frozen in place, just staring at me. When I got home, usually so noisy, now eerie quiet, there it was, the window, wide open again. My stomach flipped. I was sure I had closed it earlier, and it reminded me of that creepy story. In my lifetime in this house, I've closed more doors than I've opened. Instant chills. I shut the window again, way more carefully this time, and went to take a shower, trying to convince myself my mind was playing tricks. But when I came out and went to grab a towel from my parents' closet, I noticed something weird. I could see a shiny object from the window. Was that the ladder from the first floor? I wrapped myself in the towel and crept closer to see, and sure enough, a teenage girl, maybe 15, was climbing down the ladder to the yard, where a group of girls were whispering. I barely heard one of them say, "Quickly." Those neighbors, they'd always felt off. They were a little too quiet. Since we moved in, I'd never seen them outside. Their windows were always dim, like no light ever quite reached them. A couple of times, I overheard my parents talking about odd encounters with them. Conversations that ended too fast, awkward silences, that kind of vibe. I never thought much of it before, but after that window thing, I started wondering, could they have been spying on us? Was it just some dumb prank? But why open the whole window? Why bother with the mosquito screen? Had they been inside? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. Something was definitely off. It was like something dark, quiet, and twisted had been creeping around for a while, just under our noses. And that gut feeling of mine, yeah, it was spot on. I was being watched, but maybe not just from the outside. So I made a plan. The next night, at around the same time as the last one, I hid near the window. When I heard that metallic sound again, I waited right below, waited till I felt an unwanted guest pressing against the window frame, and then I stood up. I came face to face with the same girl of the day before, the neighbor's daughter probably. Her face left me breathless. I found myself mimicking her deer caught in the headlights expression. She was like a negative image of me, exactly the same with inverted colors. Her skin and hair were as dark as the night, a hypnotic contrast with her pale, almost translucent blue eyes. The situation was so surreal that all I could blunt out was, "Hi? Hi, Daisy." She forced a smile that no longer carried the nervousness of someone caught red-handed. Now it was a grin from someone who was going to really enjoy what happened next. That's when I knew I was in trouble. Suddenly, she grabbed my wrist and slammed it against the frame. The metal dug deeply, marking my fragile skin as I tried to pull away, but her grip was iron. Her unblinking pale eyes brimmed with a fury that felt far too vast for her young face. "So you like throwing your trash in our bins, huh?" she hissed. Her question was so utterly absurd it made me dizzy, as though the world itself had tilted. "I counted 6 bags," she continued. "So why don't we hang them here, on your window?" Before I could process it, she pulled out bags from behind her and began hanging them on the windowsill. The plastic sound cut through the beeping in my ears. 1 bag, 2, 3. The rancid stench was the worst I'd ever smelled in my life. It wasn't me. "Please look at me," I gasped. "I'm only a few years older than you. I never take out the trash. Blame my parents, but not me." It was true, but she wasn't listening. Her eyes were empty, as if she were lost in some kind of trance. With one final, almost mechanical movement, she finished hanging the last bag, its contents spilling slightly over the edge of the sill. She leaned back to admire her work and, for a second, loosened her grip on my wrist. That second was enough. I pulled my arm away and staggered back, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I couldn't move fast enough. I ran. I screamed for my dad. Luckily, it was his day off. I blurted out everything. He didn't hesitate. He marched straight to their house. "Shit," I heard the girl mutter from the window, followed by quick footsteps. Her voice carried the same nervousness she had when I first surprised her. I hurried to look. Behind the glass, I saw her shouting to the same group of girls. "Someone stop him. It's almost midnight." I saw my dad was greeted by an old woman in a wheelchair who came out of the house. Her twisted frame and hunched shoulders made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming urge to stop my dad, so I ran downstairs, but to my horror, it was too late. She reached out to him, her frail hand trembling, and time seemed to freeze as they made contact. It all happened so slowly, yet so fast. I looked at her ancient, disfigured face, and somehow in her twisted lines and shadowed contours, I found all the answers to my questions. I knew exactly what was going to happen. It was as clear as the window's glass. At that moment, I felt as if I were also falling into a hypnotic trance. The world around me blurred like she was the only existing thing in the universe. That woman possessed a dark, ancient power, so old that nobody could say how many centuries it had walked among us. Perhaps it was older than time itself. And this was a ritual steeped in vile and unspeakable darkness. By touching my dad under the full moon at midnight, the life bled from his body into hers, leaving behind a hollow, lifeless shell. My mind immediately conjured the vivid image of my father's heart stopping inside his chest and his body falling like a rock, sinking in the river under the cold light of the moon. But to my surprise, he didn't drop dead on the spot. Instead, his body began to shake and twist. I live in a 5-story apartment complex, and my bathroom has an odd setup. One mirror faces another, creating an infinity effect. One of the mirrors is part of the medicine cabinet. When you look into one, the reflections seem to stretch endlessly, like they're pulling you into some otherworldly void. I've lived here for almost 2 years now, just me and my daughter, and those mirrors have always made me feel uneasy. There's this strange, almost unreal sensation when I look into them, like I'm slipping out of reality. Maybe it's a kind of depersonalization, but whatever it is, it's unsettling. When I stare too long, it stops feeling like I'm looking at my own reflection. Instead, it feels like someone else is staring back at me, someone who knows far too much about me. It gives me the creeps. This morning, something felt especially off. As I moved my head slightly, I noticed that one of the reflections, about the 9th one back, was delayed. It didn't move in sync with the others. For a split second, it just stood there, watching before catching up. I brushed it off. Sleep deprivation can play tricks on your mind, and having a newborn means I'm running on fumes most of the time. That night, after putting my daughter back to bed for the 3rd time, I went to the bathroom again. It happened again, but this time the delay was closer, around the 5th reflection. It was far more noticeable. My stomach dropped, and a cold wave of fear washed over me. I realized I've always felt uneasy around mirrors, though I never gave it much thought before. I remembered a time years ago when I was tripping and stared into a mirror for what felt like hours. Ever since then, I haven't been the same. Mirrors don't feel like mere glass to me. They feel like doorways, and whatever's on the other side, I don't want to know. The next night was quiet until 3 a.m. I woke up to feed my daughter. After putting her back to bed, I headed to the bathroom. That's when I heard it, a low, hollow thump from behind the medicine cabinet. The sound made me freeze. My heart started pounding, and before I could talk myself out of it, I swung the mirror open. What I saw wasn't the shelf of medicines I was expecting. There was no shelf. Instead, there was a gaping, dark hole that seemed to stretch back endlessly. And standing in the center of that void was a figure. It looked just like me. No, not exactly like me. Its features were unnaturally smooth, like it had been carved from porcelain. Its eyes were pitch black, deep, empty voids that seemed to swallow the dim bathroom light. It tilted its head, and the movement was accompanied by a sharp clicking sound, like bones snapping into place. I slammed the cabinet shut so hard the mirror cracked. My hands were shaking as I ran down the hall to my daughter's room. But when I opened the door, the crib was empty. She was gone. Panic took over. My mind raced as I ran from room to room. Then I heard it, a sound that stopped me cold. Crying. It was coming from the living room. I bolted down the stairs and found her lying on the couch. But something was wrong. As I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't her. It looked like her, but something was off. Her movements were stiff, unnatural. The crying stopped abruptly as she turned to look at me. Her wide eyes glistened in the dim light. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that sent chills down my spine. I backed away, trembling, and before I could think of what to do, I blacked out. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. My daughter was in her crib, cooing like nothing had happened, but there's one thing I can't shake. She's developed a strange fascination with mirrors. She stares at them for hours, giggling and reaching out like she's playing with someone or something only she can see.